She vanished without a sound, her teacup still warm, her knitting untouched, and her mirror cracked from the inside. In the quiet village of Darnley Green, no one suspected the kindly old schoolteacher would become the centre of a case so dark, even time itself refused to remember her. This isn't just a disappearance, it's a message from someone or something that never left. Welcome to Agatha Christie's The Missing Grandma, a Miss Marple mystery. Stay sharp, watch closely, you'll need every clue. Chapter 1. A teacup still warm. The village of Darnley Green had a rhythm all its own, one that moved gently between the hands of an old church clock and the rustling of leaves that rarely fell too fast. It was the sort of place where days arrived in familiar clothing, and people, though not quite fond of gossip, often spoke in quiet tones about the changing of seasons, not scandals. And yet, that morning, something felt wrong. Not loudly so, just wrong. The mist lingered longer than usual. It hung heavy between the hedges, clouded the cobbled paths, and seemed to hesitate before the ivy-covered windows of number 9 Peony Lane, a lace-curtained cottage known for its tidiness, its punctuality, and the woman who lived there, Eleanor Weatherby. Miss Weatherby, as she was called by most who didn't know her well, and Miss Ellie by the children she no longer taught, was a woman of remarkable consistency. She walked to the post office at precisely 9, returned with the mail, took tea at 11, and always, without fail, sat by her hearth with a knitted shawl and the radio on at 4. There were few things more predictable in Darnley Green than the creak of her garden gate at the stroke of noon. So when that gate remained untouched by midday, and no gentle cough echoed down her walkway, the silence did not merely feel still, it felt watched. By 4 o'clock, the neighbours began to worry. Not publicly, of course. They waited for signs, the flicker of a light behind the lace, the silhouette of her frame by the window, the radio's crackling report from the BBC. But the house stood quiet, still, undisturbed, until Mrs. Lavinia Price, widowed, vigilant and keeper of the village's unofficial observations, stepped across the path with a tray of scones in hand and hesitation in her breath. She would say later that she knocked gently first, then firmly, then once more, but not out of alarm, simply because she thought Eleanor might be napping. The knock echoed back to her, too loudly for such soft contact. No reply. The scones, already cooling, trembled slightly in her grip. She knocked again, still nothing, and yet, inside, a faint ticking persisted, not from a wall clock or a ceiling fan, but from the small mantel clock above the hearth. It kept time relentlessly, even as the rest of the house seemed to forget its place in the day. Mrs. Pride tried the handle. Unlocked. She would later tell Miss Marple that she hesitated on the threshold, not out of fear, but out of a strange sense that she was interrupting something, that the house, though warm, was holding its breath. She stepped in, the kettle silent, the radio unplugged. The fire, long since turned to embers, but there, on the small side table beside Eleanor's usual armchair, sat a single teacup. Porcelain, blue-checked trim, and the steam still curled upward as if it had only just been set down. A knitting needle dangled idly beside it, looped through half of a pearl grey row. And beside it, folded precisely in thirds, lay Eleanor's shawl, the one she never went without. No sign of struggle, no sign of departure, no note. No coat missing from the rack, only the scent of chamomile and something faintly metallic beneath it. Mrs. Price stepped forward slowly, her heels silent against the rug. She reached for the shawl as if touching it would somehow summon its owner, and then paused, noticing something folded beneath the cup's saucer. A piece of paper, old, slightly yellowed at the edge, torn unevenly as though ripped in haste, the corner of a child's drawing. A crayon line, a red curve, maybe the start of a balloon or a sun. 2 small dots above it, not quite eyes, the kind of drawing children give their favourite teacher. But the face was incomplete, scratched over, then over again. Mrs. Price didn't scream. She didn't even gasp. She stepped backward, carefully, reverently, as though leaving an altar, and shut the door behind her. Within the hour, Miss Marple was summoned. She arrived not in haste, but with intention, one gloved hand clutching a black notebook, the other trailing her cane, not from need, but preference, as she often said. It helped her pace her thoughts. Her eyes, sharp behind her soft-spun spectacles, took in the house without a word. She did not ask what was missing. She asked what had remained. The teacup, the shawl, the drawing. She paused longest at the drawing. "Children don't often forget to finish a smile," she murmured, almost to herself. There were no fingerprints, none that shouldn't be there. But the paper. Miss Marple turned it over in her hands as gently as one might hold a moth with a broken wing. Wasn't from any paper stock sold locally. And it had the scent of something old. Wood oil, perhaps. The sort used in school desks, long since out of use. "Where's the calendar?" Miss Marple asked. "In the kitchen," Mrs. Pry replied, puzzled. "But what?" Miss Marple had already moved. Inside the kitchen, neatly hung by the doorframe, was Eleanor's calendar, and circled in faint blue pencil was yesterday's date. Nothing odd, except that the rest of the calendar was empty. No appointments, no reminders, just that one silent circle. Miss Marple tore the page free and held it to the light. Faint indentations, a list, names or phrases. She retrieved a small brush from her bag, dusted graphite across the paper's reverse. Words emerged faintly. "If she comes again, don't let her speak. Keep the mirror covered. Tell the postman nothing. No names, no initials, just instructions. Half-remembered rules from a forgotten bedtime tale." Miss Marple returned to the drawing. She stared at the unfinished smile, then at the fireplace, then at the glass of the mantel clock. A fine crack had run down its side. Too precise to be old, too new to be accidental. "Has anyone entered the house besides Mrs. Price?" she asked. "No," replied the constable, "just the neighbour and you." She said, then added quietly, "Then someone else, left without being seen." That night Miss Marple stayed in Eleanor's cottage. She insisted, said she wished to get a feel for the place. The villagers whispered that she was waiting. For a clue or a ghost, no one was sure. At 2:17 a.m. the mantel clock stopped ticking. Miss Marple sat quietly, the only light from the candle beside her chair. The fire was out, yet warmth clung to the room like breath on a window pane. She stood, moved to the hearth. Kneeling, she reached under the chair. Dust. Yarn. And then, beneath the edge of the rug, a second piece of paper. A matching tear. A corner with the letter E written in a child's hand. She pressed it beside the first. The edges aligned. Imperfectly, but truly. The smile was part of a larger face. It was no child's drawing, not really. It was a memory, fragmented and waiting. She stared into the empty chair where the shawl had once sat, and for a moment, just a moment, she swore she saw the fabric crease, as though someone had just risen from it. Miss Marple did not blink, because there was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her, and someone, or something, was watching. The mystery of Eleanor Weatherby has only just begun. Why did she leave her teacup untouched? Why did her calendar carry cryptic warnings? And who, or what, was she trying to hide from? Watch closely. The clues are already in place. And if you're the sort to spot things others miss, you may just uncover what's been buried too long. Subscribe now for more stories that vanish into mirrors, unless you remember them. Because in Darnley Green, time doesn't forget. It just rewrites. Chapter 2. Eleanor Weatherby's Secrets. There are lives that speak loudly, lives that announce themselves with drama, disturbance and declarations, and then there are lives like Eleanor Weatherby's. Lives that whisper. But whispers, as Miss Marple knew, had their own kind of weight. the sort of weight that clings to corners, that echoes in the silence after doors are closed, that leaves traces not on paper but in memory, half-formed and waiting. The morning after the teacup incident, the mist had lifted slightly, though the sky remained the colour of unpolished pewter. A soft drizzle tapped against Miss Marple's umbrella as she stepped from the threshold of Eleanor's cottage and turned, as if listening. She stood for a moment, not for the weather, but for something else. The kind of stillness that does not feel earned, but enforced. She made her way up Peony Lane with quiet determination, stopping first at number 4, the home of Mr. and Mrs. Caleb Dunridge, both long retired, both notoriously attentive to village goings-on, and both with a memory for details that Miss Marple found far more reliable than any newspaper report. She did not knock loudly, nor did she introduce herself. She simply tilted her head politely and said, "You were friends with Miss Weatherby, were you not?" Mrs. Dunridge, short and broad-hipped, with hair pinned as if for a war that never ended, ushered her in without resistance. The kettle was already on. "Yes, Eleanor," she said, setting a blue cup before Miss Marple. "Always polite, always precise, never a toe out of place. Taught at St. Albans, you know, before they closed it. Brilliant with the quiet children." Miss Marple made a note. She had always found it curious, the way people described others by what they were, not what they did, as if identity, once assigned, was never allowed to change. "And did she ever mention family?" she asked. At this, Mr. Dunridge snorted from behind his newspaper. "One," he said, "but not since the Jubilee. Daughter, wasn't it?" Mrs. Dunridge whispered. "Name of Cecily, or Celeste, something like that. Bit of a scandal, ran off with a stage actor, if I recall. Broke Eleanor's heart, never spoke of her again." "But was she ever seen again?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Dunridge paused. Her brow furrowed. "Come to think of it, no. No photographs, no mention. It was as if she'd been erased." Miss Marple sipped the tea. Too bitter. She left shortly after, her thoughts trailing not behind her, but circling her like unseen birds. The second stop was the church. St. Bride's, quiet now, but still attended by the faithful and the forgetful alike. The Reverend Crispin, a man of 80 but with a voice that could still fill stone halls, welcomed Miss Marple in as if she were part of the altar cloth. "She used to sit right there," he said, pointing toward the second pew. "Third from the left. Never missed a service, but never took communion. That always puzzled me." Miss Marple inclined her head. "You don't suppose it was guilt?" The Reverend blinked. "She never spoke of it, but there was a heaviness to her, yes. A woman who smiled, but never deeply, as if her joy had limits." Miss Marple asked to see the church records. Births, marriages, deaths. She found Eleanor's name once, in 1947, marked as educator, unmarried, confirmed member. No mention of a child, no record of Cecily. She turned the pages carefully, but even careful pages can hide things. At the back of the ledger, faint and nearly rubbed out, was a note scribbled diagonally across the margin. "Weatherby, requested name removal, 1959. Initials beside it. C. W. But there was no clergy with those initials on record. Miss Marple closed the book. "You haven't had a Charles Whitlow here, have you?" she asked. The Reverend looked puzzled. "Not in my time, and not before it, as far as I know." Then who had altered the book? Outside, the drizzle had stopped, but the sky still felt heavy. Her final stop for the day was the local school, long since turned into a museum of sorts. The old desks remained, as did the portraits. Black and white, sepia-toned, faces of children caught forever in mid-law, mid-frown, mid-forgetfulness. Miss Marple moved slowly through the halls, glancing at plaques, reading the dust-smudged names. When she reached the photograph dated 1964, Miss Weatherby's final class, she stopped. There were 14 children in the image, 11 named on the brass plate beneath. The last 3 simply listed as unknown. But they were not unknown. One she recognised. Not from the village, but from a postcard found in Eleanor's nightstand. The boy with the patch on his blazer. He had written to Eleanor in 1972, asking if she remembered the box under the stairs. Why would a student write that to a teacher? Unless it meant something else entirely. Miss Marple stared at the centre of the photo. Eleanor stood straight, unsmiling, one hand on the shoulder of the unnamed girl. The girl was looking away, not at the camera but to the left, eyes fixed on something out of frame. And in the corner of the photograph, barely visible, was what appeared to be a curtain. But not a school curtain, velvet, the sort used in a theatre. She leaned closer. A faint pattern. Vines? No. Letters, an E, then a W. Was it a stage curtain or something else? She asked the museum's caretaker, a woman named Delia, who had once been Eleanor's student, about the photo. Delia hesitated. That photo used to have 15 children, she said quietly, but one faded out, bit by bit, like the photo was forgetting her. Miss Marple didn't respond. She returned home to Eleanor's cottage. She lit a candle, soft and low, and opened Eleanor's journal once more. She read the last entry again, but this time with new eyes. She's back. She never aged. Could it have been Cecily, a daughter, a twin? She moved to the attic, carefully, one step at a time. Each creak seemed louder in the silence. She had not searched it fully the night before, but tonight something pulled her upward. At the top, a narrow hatch. She reached up and pushed. Dust fell in lazy sheets. The air was colder. The candle flickered. Inside, cobwebs laced over forgotten boxes. A child's rocking horse, its paint chipped, its eyes missing. A stack of books bound together by twine. Children's primers, all with the same name written inside. C. Weatherby. Not E. Weatherby. She picked up a notebook, opened it. Inside, sketches. Not elegant, but determined, pages and pages of the same face. Eleanor's face, drawn by a child's hand, sometimes smiling, sometimes scowling, and once with no face at all. In the back of the notebook, one sentence repeated, "I am not her. She is not me." The candle flickered violently, though there was no wind, and then she heard it. A soft thump. From above, not the floor, not the rafters, the window. She turned slowly, raising the candle. There, across the attic, past the rocking horse, past the forgotten books, was a small, round window, covered in grime, and behind it, for the briefest of moments, a face. Not Eleanor's, not quite. Smiling, then gone. Miss Marple did not scream. She did not even move. She simply lowered the candle and whispered, "There's always something left behind." Chapter 3. A window that shouldn't open. The attic of number 9 Peony Lane was not built for visitors. Its beams were low, the air dry and difficult to breathe, and the floorboards, each one more reluctant than the last, protested beneath every step, like the groans of forgotten time. But Miss Marple, unhurried as ever, climbed the narrow staircase with a candle in one hand and a journal tucked beneath her arm. She was not frightened, not truly, not in the conventional sense of the word. Rather, she was aware that some rooms, though silent, had not finished speaking. The candle's flame quivered slightly as she stepped onto the attic floor. The door creaked inwards and stopped halfway. Wedged against a box covered in dust thick enough to write apologies in. The window at the far end, round and rimmed in iron, greeted her not with light, but with a greyish hue, as if daylight itself refused to look directly inside. She paused. The air was too still for such wind-blown shadows, and yet something had moved. She felt it, not in her eyes, but in the quiet displacement of breath, the way old fabric shifts when touched from beneath. She lowered the candle to waist height, allowing its glow to stretch along the wooden floor. Shapes emerged, trunks, old curtains. A child's rocking horse she remembered seeing briefly the day before. It was tilted now, one runner raised slightly off the ground, as if something had rocked it and then fled. To her left sat a wooden dollhouse, its paint faded and windows cracked. A small door hung open on the second floor. She did not touch it. Some things are more telling when left undisturbed. Her attention returned to the window. It was the only thing not coated in dust. The floor beneath it bore faint marks, scrapes, as if something had been pushed aside recently. She moved closer. The iron hinges were rusted, visibly so. But the latch was clean. Too clean, and though its bolts were thick with corrosion, the pane itself, once clouded with grime, was strangely transparent, as if someone, just recently, had wiped it with a sleeve. She reached out. The frame gave way. Too easily. The window opened, and the wind entered, not like a guest, but like a memory. It crept through the beams with a soft whine, lifting cobwebs and scattering a thin layer of dust from the sill. The candle guttered, the flame bending toward the opening, as if drawn to whatever had passed through. Then came the sound. Not loud, not even clear, but unmistakable. A tune, hummed, off-key. A lullaby. She turned her head slightly, listening. It wasn't inside, not exactly. It was behind, below her, as if it echoed from the floor beneath, from Eleanor's bedroom. But the room was empty. She'd seen it herself. Still, the notes continued. 3, then 4, and then silence. She took a step back from the window, and that's when she saw it. A shoe, small, leather cracked at the sole, far too small for Eleanor. It sat half-buried beneath a blanket in the corner, positioned almost carefully, as if someone had meant to hide it, but changed their mind at the last moment. She knelt slowly, lifted it. There was dust on the toe, but none inside. No spiderwebs, no insects. It hadn't been there long. Certainly not long enough to have gathered years. She turned it over. Written in faded ink across the inner arch, C.W. The same initials she'd seen scribbled into the church record. She set the shoe aside and returned to the window. The candlelight caught on the glass, and in the reflection, for a moment, just a flicker, she saw a figure. A girl, not older than 10, hair pulled back, expression unreadable. She turned instantly. No one. But the rocking horse, it had moved. Not a great distance, just enough to notice. The runner now flat, the horse still. Miss Marple did not speak. She simply returned to the far side of the attic, toward a stack of trunks she had ignored the day before. She set the candle on top and opened the latch. Inside, linens, children's clothes, 2 hand-drawn cards. One read, "To Miss Weatherby, happy birthday," in a child's hand. The other, unsigned, read only, "I'm not going back. Please, don't make me." She opened the second trunk. Books, dozens of them. Children's primers, fairy tales and journals. Eleanor's, by the look of the binding. She lifted the top one. The edges were worn, the pages stiff, the ink faded but legible. She flipped to the first page. A record of thoughts, May 1955. They say memory fades with age, but some memories do not dim, they sharpen. They become knives instead of shadows. The entries were methodical at first. Notes about lessons, about Cecily's behaviour, about the difficulty of managing a gifted child with a twin tendency. That phrase appeared again and again. Twin tendency. Then, long gaps between entries. Weeks, sometimes months. Then, one from March 1959. She speaks to herself in the mirror now, not as a game, as if she sees someone else. Then, from 1961. I caught her drawing me again, but this time the face had no mouth. Miss Marple turned the page. The ink changed. Darker, more erratic, letters crossed out. She told me I wasn't the real one. She said she was born first, that I took her name, that the face in the glass was hers. I should have locked the door, but she was already inside. The final page contained only one line. She's back. She never aged. Miss Marple closed the journal. She sat still for a long moment, the candle flickering beside her. The wind, for now, had ceased. But the silence wasn't empty, it was watching. And somewhere below, perhaps in a reflection or perhaps beneath the floorboards, a question remained unanswered. Had Eleanor been hiding, or had she been hidden? Chapter 4. Suspicions Rise. The Garden Watcher. There are places in the world that invite silence. Cathedrals, graveyards, libraries, but Eleanor Weatherby's garden was not one of them. It had always hummed with quiet life, from the rustle of her roses to the gentle creak of the greenhouse door that never shut properly. Children had once played along its cobblestone paths. Elderly neighbours had leaned across its hedges to admire the irises in spring, and Eleanor herself had spent countless hours tending to it, pruning by hand even when her knuckles had stiffened with age. Yet now it stood frozen, as if the very soil had paused to listen. Miss Marple walked its narrow, winding path with the carefulness of someone navigating a space not just for clues, but for memories. It had rained the night before, the ground was still soft, and the grass, wet at the edges, clung to her shoes as she moved past the hedge. A robin flitted from one barren branch to another and vanished behind the garden shed. There was no wind. Not even the leaves moved. She stopped near the base of the large rosebush, the oldest in the garden, with a root system that twisted like fingers buried in the earth. Something had shifted here. She could feel it before she saw it. A slight depression in the soil, covered in loose mulch that had been rearranged with more haste than skill. Someone had dug here recently, and someone else had tried, less convincingly, to make it look as though they had not. Behind her, the gate creaked. She turned, slowly. No one. Only the latch swinging slightly, though the breeze was absent. Miss Marple knelt beside the rosebush. Her fingers, though aged and lined, still moved with elegant purpose. She brushed away the mulch with the tips, then the soil gently, layer by layer, like turning pages in a book that hadn't been read in decades. After 6 inches, her hand struck something. Wood. No, not quite. Oilskin. She uncovered the object completely. A rectangular bundle, wrapped tight in dark fabric, tied with thin twine now damp with earth. She sat back on her heels and paused, not out of hesitation, but reverence. She knew, without needing to open it, that what lay inside would not answer her questions. It would only ask more. She untied the knot. The fabric peeled back. A small tin box. Unmarked. Rusted at the corners. When she opened it, the hinges gave a soft groan, reluctant but not resistant. Inside, teeth. Not many. 6, perhaps 7 baby teeth. Tiny, clean, carefully arranged in a cloth lined with lace edging, the kind found on children's pillowcases. And beneath them, a photograph. She lifted it slowly. The edges were worn, frayed slightly at the corner, but the image remained. Eleanor, much younger, 40 perhaps, less, standing in the garden, this very garden, a rose in hand. Beside her, a child, a girl of about 8, short hair, a ribbon tied to one side, her face scratched out. Not torn, not erased, but scratched. Viciously, as if by a nail. Not once, but many times. Deep enough that the surface of the photo had begun to tear through. The rest of the image was untouched. Miss Marple stared at it a long time. And then the gate creaked again. She rose and turned swiftly. This time, someone stood there. A man in his 60s, perhaps older, with soil still clinging to his cuffs and a trowel in one hand. He didn't seem startled to see her, only mildly inconvenienced. "You must be Miss Marple," he said. She nodded. "Albert Cleves," he added. "I do the hedges." She motioned to the rosebush. "Recently?" He shrugged. "Week ago, she told me not to touch that one." She, Mrs. Weatherby, said it was watching the house. Odd phrasing. She was an odd woman. Miss Marple lifted the photograph. "Do you recognise this?" He looked, eyes narrowed. "No." "The girl?" "No, she was never seen with children." He hesitated then, only slightly. "She "Didn't have children," he said flatly. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Are you sure?" He raised his eyebrows, a touch defensive. "I've worked this garden for 20 years. She never once mentioned a daughter. No toys, no visits, no birthdays, nothing." Miss Marple looked back down at the box. And then the air changed. Not in temperature, not in light, but in pressure. The kind of stillness that settles only when something that should be there suddenly isn't. She turned her head slowly. The photograph was gone. The tin box still sat in her lap, the teeth still arranged as before, but the photograph, which she had just set atop the lid, had vanished. Albert looked down. "You sure you had it?" Miss Marple didn't answer. She rose, closing the box, brushing the soil from her coat. The robin returned then. It landed on the rosebush, looked at her, then flew directly toward the attic window, circled once, and disappeared. She stood there for some time, watching that window. It had been cleaned again, and though the afternoon sun did not reach the glass, the light that came through it flickered. Inside the house, Eleanor's journals remained stacked by the hearth, undisturbed. But a new one had appeared, not with the others. This one sat open on the table, unlabelled, not yet yellowed by time. She approached. The ink was still wet. She's not buried. She's beneath. She closed the book. And then, for the first time since she'd arrived at Peony Lane, Miss Marple walked through the house in silence, not with caution nor suspicion, but with something else. Resolve. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. Chapter 5. The Second Eleanor. There are questions one only learns to ask when the familiar begins to fracture, when a life long presumed solid shows signs of warping at the seams. It was not the teacup, nor the missing photograph, nor even the whispers of a figure at the attic window that truly unsettled Miss Marple. It was the feeling that she had been made to look too long in one direction, while something important waited quietly just beyond her peripheral vision. So, on a morning still wrapped in grey mist, she boarded a train to the county records office in Penbury Hollow. She carried no luggage, only a notebook, an umbrella, and a single folded page from Eleanor's diary. A page on which no names were written, but where an address had once been underlined, then furiously scratched out. 191 Greystone Road, West March. Not a place Eleanor had ever mentioned, not to neighbours, not in letters, not in the records kept by Reverend Crispin or Mrs. Price, and yet it appeared several times throughout the journals, in fragments, often without context. It had the texture of a memory, unwelcome, persistent, threaded through time like a bruise beneath fading skin. The archives office in Pembury was kept in an old municipal building, a former courthouse turned library of sorts, where dust motes floated as freely as paper. The attendant, a man in his 50s with a face shaped like a question mark, guided Miss Marple to the index room, with the polite suspicion reserved for those who asked for files more than 50 years old. She began at the beginning. Eleanor Marguerite Weatherby, born April 2nd, 1924. Darnley Green census rolls listed her as unmarried, schoolteacher, residing in the village since 1948. But it was the West March files that unearthed something else. Another Eleanor Weatherby, same date of birth, different parents, same middle name, same profession, but the record ended abruptly. Status, deceased, filed in 1983, and beneath that, scribbled in the registrar's notes, a formality more than a requirement, stood the name of the declarant, Eleanor M. Weatherby. Miss Marple's fingers paused on the edge of the page. She blinked once, slowly, as if trying to coax her own comprehension into focus. The Eleanor now missing had declared the other Eleanor dead. But how could one Eleanor Weatherby, born the same day with the same name, declare another dead unless she had known her, unless she had seen her? And if that were the case, had she seen a mirror, or had she seen herself? The archivist leaned in then, perhaps sensing something unspoken. "You all right, madam?" She smiled softly, folded the documents, and thanked him without answering. On the return train, the rain began, not heavy but steady, just enough to mute the outside world, to smooth the edges of thought. She read the names again. 2 Eleanors, 1 vanished, 1 declared the other gone, but which one had truly disappeared? That night she returned to Eleanor's house and lit the fireplace, not out of chill, but ritual. Flames always helped her think. She placed the documents side by side on the dining table. There was a familiarity to them. Handwriting matched. Even the signatures, though separated by years, were nearly identical. It was as if the same woman had signed for 2 lives. And perhaps she had. The journals were no help. The older ones were neat, structured, formal in tone, written by someone aware they might be read, but the newer entries, they had changed. The voice had turned, more raw, more urgent, and sometimes, in the margins, words were scratched in different ink. Which one am I? She walks like me. We made a pact. Miss Marple rose then, guided not by logic, but by instinct. She returned to the attic, this time not with a candle, but with a small lantern and the same oilskin box she'd uncovered near the roses. She placed the lantern near the rocking horse, which had shifted again, now turned to face the wall, as if punished. There was one chest she had not yet opened. It sat beneath a stack of linens, behind an old sewing table with one leg broken at the base. She knelt and pulled it free. Inside, paperwork, receipts, ledgers, envelopes, and a letter. Unsent, sealed. Addressed to whom remembers her. Miss Marple opened it slowly. The writing was uneven, the strokes sharp. Ink pooled in the curves. If you are reading this, then I failed. She came back, as I always feared. Not from the garden, nor from the mirror, but from the past we tried to burn. She wasn't buried. I was. She walked away, I stayed behind. And then I became her. No name, no signature. Only a drawing beneath it, the same child's face, unfinished, the mouth erased, as if it had never been granted voice. Miss Marple stood there in the flickering attic light, watching her own reflection in the attic window begin to fade as the lantern burned lower. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting for her. And downstairs, though no one had entered, the front door began to creak open, slowly, as if invited by memory. Chapter 6. The Lady in the Organ Loft. Sunday arrived with a reluctant sun, the kind that peered shyly through the grey, not with warmth but with the soft curiosity of a light unsure of where it belonged. In Darnley Green, the Sabbath held its traditions tight. Quiet breakfasts, polished shoes, and hymns sung not out of obligation but memory. And at the centre of it all stood St. Bride's Church. A stone fixture of cracked spires and stained glass, its doors never locked, even when perhaps they should have been. Miss Marple arrived early, not out of piety but preparation. She chose a seat near the back, 2 rows behind the pillar with the rain-marked psalter from which she had observed many a parishioner unknowingly reveal more in silence than they did in speech. Her eyes, as ever, moved more than her head. She watched, not the altar, but the people, their entrances, their seating choices. There had been talk, earlier that week, of a woman seen crossing the chapel lawn after dusk. Long coat, head uncovered, pace deliberate, as though drawn by something other than faith. No one knew her name, nor had she spoken to anyone, but she was described the same way by each villager. Not young, not old, but unfamiliar. It was during the 3rd hymn, as the choir reached a wavering chord at the end of Abide With Me, that something shifted. The organ, unmanned until that moment, gave a note. Just one. Low. Too low. Off-key. And unmistakably played. Heads turned, but only slightly. A murmur rippled through the back rows. The organist, Mr. Kilburn, was on holiday. No one had been seated at the instrument when the service began. Miss Marple turned her gaze upward. The organ loft, high above the pulpit, hidden by shadows and oak panelling, was no longer empty. A woman stood there. Tall, slender, clothed in what appeared to be a 1940s evening gown. Lace sleeves, a high collar, dark fabric that shimmered oddly despite the absence of sunlight. She wore no hat, and her hair, Pinned up in a style long out of fashion was the colour of old photographs. She stood perfectly still, her hands resting on the railing, watching. But not the congregation. She was watching the altar. No one had seen her enter. No door had opened, no step had creaked. And yet there she stood, with the calm of someone long familiar with the place, as if returning from a long absence to a room that remembered her better than she remembered herself. Then a whisper. "She's the one who is buried in the garden." Miss Marple did not turn to identify the voice. It came from her left, 3 pews up, but the speaker had already folded back into the fabric of the parish. The vicar, Reverend Crispin, hesitated mid-prayer. His gaze followed the others. He saw her, blinked once, then continued. When the final hymn began, she was gone. No footsteps, no door creak, nothing. Just the memory of her presence, lingering like perfume. Miss Marple rose before the final blessing and quietly made her way to the side stair, the narrow stone climb leading up to the organ loft, rarely used except by the caretaker or the odd curious choir boy. The dust along the banister had been disturbed. At the top, the air felt thinner, colder. The bench was slightly out of place, one of its legs angled oddly, as if someone had stood on it for too long. A single object lay on the keys, a hymn book, old, leather-bound. St. Bride stamped in gold leaf on the cover. But on the first page, where a dedication might normally be written, someone had scrawled a name, not in ink, but in something darker. E. Weatherby. The strokes were uneven, trembling, but it wasn't the ink that unsettled her, it was the colour. Too red, too vivid, fresh. And the smell, faint metallic. Miss Marple closed the book gently, carefully, and turned to examine the rest of the loft. A single candle stub sat by the ledge, melted into the stone as if it had been burned slowly, patiently, for hours. She ran her hand along the railing. A thread of fabric had caught in the splintered edge, velvet, midnight blue. The same material Eleanor had worn in the photograph found in the oilskin box. She knelt briefly, observing the dust again. There were 2 sets of prints, one small, delicate, the other barefoot. Then came the sound, a slow, deliberate creak, not from above, from below. From the back corner of the church, tucked behind a faded tapestry depicting the Sermon on the Mount, stood the old confession booth. Unused for years, its door warped, its interior long rumoured to be draughty and cold. And now, its door was moving, just a sliver, opening. No one was near it, no one had touched it, yet it creaked open wider, inch by inch, until the gap yawned just wide enough to suggest invitation. Miss Marple did not approach, not yet. She descended the staircase slowly, the hymn book clutched to her chest, her fingers damp. The parishioners were filing out, most unaware, a few whispering. Reverend Crispin met her at the door. "Miss Marple," he said carefully. "Did you?" "I saw her," she replied. "And do you think she saw you?" "No," she said, eyes lingering on the confession booth across the aisle. "I think she saw someone else." He swallowed. "Do you know who?" Miss Marple looked at the hymn book. "She knew who she was," she said, "but I suspect she no longer knows which one." That night, Miss Marple placed the hymn book beside the others. She did not burn it, nor bury it. She simply waited, and while the fire cracked in the hearth, the confession booth door at St. Bride's remained open, waiting for someone to speak, for someone to remember, for someone to confess what had never been said. What if the person you trusted most had been someone else all along? What if the truth you were taught to believe was written in someone else's hand? And what if a name was just a mask worn long enough that even the wearer forgot they were wearing it? If you're drawn to stories where names shift, mirrors speak, and nothing is what it appears, subscribe now. There are still 9 chapters ahead, and only one will reveal the truth. Because there's one truth left unspoken, and it is waiting. Still. Chapter 7. The timelines blur. Time, when examined too closely, resists certainty. Ask a village clockmaker and he will tell you that gears can shift, that hands may slow or leap forward with the quiet panic of a spring wound too tightly. But what happens when time misbehaves? Not on the clock, but in the mind, when hours rewrite themselves in memory, and the past begins to wear the face of the present. Darnley Green had always obeyed time. It was a village of traditions, routines, anniversaries, quietly marked, and stories carefully passed down with no variation. That was until Eleanor Weatherby vanished, and the first clock stopped. It began at the greengrocer's. Mrs. Tilling swore that her wall clock, a wedding gift from her grandmother, began to tick backward for several minutes just after sunrise. She'd looked up, puzzled, as the minute hand spun counterclockwise in smooth, uninterrupted motion. When she looked again, it had resumed as normal, but the potatoes she'd already bagged were gone from the counter. She assumed she'd imagined it, until it happened again the next day. Then, at the post office, the postmaster noticed something odd. The portrait of Queen Elizabeth had shifted, not the frame, the portrait itself. The gaze was different, tilted, less formal, more curious. He adjusted it, but the next morning it had returned, watching from a slightly different angle. And at the schoolhouse, now only used for Sunday fairs, Miss Claremont, retired, sharp as ever, insisted that the commemorative class photograph from 1964 had changed. She remembered it perfectly. Eleanor Weatherby standing behind a group of 10 pupils, her hand on the shoulder of one girl in the front row. But now Eleanor was in the front row too. Not aged, not as a teacher, as a child. Same face, different body. A girl in a buttoned dress with the same careful expression, the same sharp eyes, and beside her, another girl looking away, almost identical. Miss Marple arrived just after the photograph had been taken down. She asked to see it. Miss Claremont, reluctant but respectful, retrieved it from a locked drawer. The image was clear, unmistakable. There were 2 Eleanors. Not twins, not lookalikes. The same face, twice. Miss Marple traced the photo with her gloved fingertip. The ink on the brass label had faded, but there was no mistake. The names were listed and repeated. Eleanor Weatherby, pupil, Eleanor Weatherby, pupil. And then the label had been scratched, very lightly, almost invisible unless viewed under angled light. One name was being erased slowly. Miss Marple returned to the village hall, where she requested access to the official town register. She had reviewed these records before, but today something was different. The ink. Where once it had been black, now one name appeared in red. Weatherby, Eleanor M. Ma'am. Resident of Darnley Green since 1948. Declared deceased. Westmarch Records, 1983. She blinked. That entry had not been there 3 days ago. She turned the page, flipped back to the original census she'd examined just last week. The handwriting was the same, still hers, as though she herself had written the date. But the years had shifted. Small things at first. The age column had changed by a single year. The column labelled household occupants now listed 2 where it had previously read 1. No names attached. Only the number. She folded the page gently, returned it to its case, and left without explanation. Outside, the wind had risen. Not loudly, but sharply, sharp enough to rustle through the ivy that clung to Eleanor's house like a shroud. Miss Marple paused at the gate and listened. There was a sound coming from within the cottage, a slow rhythmic click. She opened the front door with care. The sound grew louder. She followed it, into the sitting room, past the still cold hearth, and toward the side cupboard. Eleanor had used to store her tapes. Cassette recordings, mostly classical, arranged in neat rows. But now, one tape lay on the table, unlabelled, and playing. She reached down, pressed rewind, then play again. Silence, then static. Then a voice. Female, breathless. She never left, she only changed faces. The voice was not Eleanor's, and yet it was. She rewound the tape again, played it twice more. Each time, the voice grew slower, not distorted but drawn out, as though something was pulling the words through water. Miss Marple set the tape down, crossed to the hallway mirror. She stared. There was only one reflection. But for a moment she saw something else. Not a person, a shift. The hallway behind her had no coat on the hook, and yet, in the reflection, Eleanor's shawl hung gently, swaying. She turned sharply. The hook was bare. She stared back at the mirror. The shawl was gone. Miss Marple did not blink. She simply moved to the kitchen, where the calendar still hung in its usual place. She turned to the month of April. There was no circle now. Where there had once been a ring around the 14th, now the page was unmarked. But pressed faintly into the paper, almost invisible, were new indentations. She tilted the page, letting the light catch them. They were numbers, dates. The 12th, the 13th, the 14th, the 15th, crossed out. One remained uncrossed, the 16th. She turned to the fireplace. There, in the ashes, something white protruded. She knelt, reached in, pulled free a small photograph, half burned. The same class picture from the schoolhouse, but this time, both Eleanors were looking at the camera and smiling. Chapter 8. The Dollmaker's Daughter. The wind had changed again, not in direction, but in temperament. It no longer whispered across Darnley Green like it had in the days before Eleanor's disappearance. Instead, it circled the houses with intention, brushing windows like fingers trailing across glass too clean, pressing against doorways with the weight of something waiting to be let in. That morning, the leaves that had once danced playfully along the garden paths no longer moved at all. They rested, still, reluctant, as if even they knew that something in the village had shifted beyond the point of recognition. Miss Marple had risen earlier than usual. She had not slept, though she had allowed her eyes to close for a time while seated by Eleanor's fireplace, her back to the mirror and her hands loosely folded in her lap, the half-burned photograph laid across her knees. Sleep was not what she needed. What she needed was memory, not her own, but Eleanor's, and perhaps the child's, whoever she was. The air inside the cottage had felt heavier as dawn approached, as though the house itself were reluctant to endure another day without its owner. Or perhaps it no longer recognized the absence as absence at all. The shawl had appeared again, this time laid neatly across the arm of the sitting-room chair, its stitching freshly cleaned, as though it had only just been folded by the woman who used to rest there. But Miss Marple had not moved to touch it. She had only written 2 lines in her notebook that morning. Memory is the most dangerous inheritance. What is remembered can become real again. By 9 o'clock she was walking through the village with her usual deliberate pace, unhurried, steady, with that slight tilt of the head that signalled both presence and preoccupation. Her destination was not a new one, but her purpose had shifted. It was the toymaker's house, now boarded, quiet, no sign of life since the strange passing 2 weeks earlier that had left his body untouched in the garden shed, eyes open, mouth filled with paper, and no explanation. The townspeople had called it natural causes, but Miss Marple had seen the message. I am her. The police had not questioned the significance. She had not volunteered it. The house stood at the edge of town, where the cobbles gave way to dirt and hedges grew more wildly than they should. Its windows were clouded with dust from the inside, and its front step was littered with petals from a nearby cherry tree that had bloomed too early this year, as though nature itself had miscalculated something. She stepped up, turned the brass knob, still cold despite the rising sun, and entered. The scent inside was unmistakable. Not decay, not rot, but sawdust, fresh, dry, clinging to the air like a fog of wood and time. The room had been untouched, or so it appeared. The dolls sat lined along shelves that bowed with age, their glassy eyes reflecting the light like dew. Some were smiling, some blank, others wearing expressions too ambiguous to name. And all of them were facing the same direction, toward the table at the centre of the room. Miss Marple approached it cautiously. A single chair stood there, its cushion depressed, as though someone had only just stood. On the table, resting upon a sheet of cloth and ringed by faint pencil lines, sat a doll, unfinished. It was made of wood, finely carved, its features half-defined. The hair, real by the look of it, was curled, auburn, pinned to the crown by a ribbon that appeared to be cut from velvet, dark blue in hue. The body was not yet clothed. The arms were joined but immobile, and the face was familiar. Not entirely formed, but already too close. The forehead, the curve of the cheek, the downturn of the lip. It was Eleanor. Or it would be. There was a note beside it, folded, thick parchment, stained slightly at the edge. She opened it slowly, carefully, as though unfolding something once crumpled in anger. She asked me to make her again. She said the old one didn't work, but she was wrong. The first one still moves when she thinks no one is looking. No signature. Miss Marple turned the note over. Nothing, only a faint crease, as though it had once been tucked into something smaller. A locket, perhaps, or a doll's palm. She examined the shelves again. Most of the dolls were old, worn at the joints. But one stood out. A small figure in a pinafore, hands folded, eyes too wide, mouth painted slightly off-centre. It stood on its own, without a stand, balanced perfectly, and pinned to its chest, almost imperceptibly, was a tag. C.W. She did not move the doll. Instead, she stepped into the back room. Here, where the toymaker had once painted details in silence, were his reference sketches, hung like wallpaper, edge to edge. Faces, dozens of them, each slightly different, but one face repeated, again and again. Eleanor, at different ages, as a child, as a young woman, as a teacher, then again, younger, until one sketch showed her as an infant, unrealistic, clearly imagined, but unmistakably drawn in her likeness. Then, a second infant, same eyes, but with a smudge across the mouth, as though the artist had tried to erase the expression but failed. Beneath it, 2 words scrawled in pencil: Dollmaker's daughter. Miss Marple turned then, catching her own reflection in the glass of the workshop cabinet. For a moment, she saw not herself, but the unfinished doll, sitting, staring. Behind her, she turned sharply. Nothing there. The chair at the table was still empty, the doll still seated, but now its arm had fallen from its lap, as if moved, not dropped, placed. Miss Marple stepped closer and looked again at the sketch. The eyes. They weren't Eleanor's. They were Cecily's. Or rather, they were both. As if 2 faces were vying for control of the same identity. She returned to the main room. Her footsteps softened. The air had grown colder. In the far corner, beside a stack of trunks, a record player rested. Not new, but functional, and placed beside it a cassette tape, unmarked. She inserted it. Pressed play. The voice was faint, but clear. If you forget her, she wins. Miss Marple waited. The tape clicked. Then a second voice. One she knew. She was never born, not properly. That's why she had to be made. Another click. She doesn't live like the rest of us. She copies. She waits. The mirror taught her how. Then silence. Not static, not noise. Pure, waiting silence. The tape did not rewind. It did not eject. It stayed, ready. Miss Marple stepped outside. The wind had stopped. The leaves had settled, and across the road, visible only in reflection from the workshop window, stood a child, dressed in blue, hair curled, expression unreadable. Miss Marple did not turn to look directly. She closed the door behind her and walked away, slowly. And behind her, the dollmaker's house remained silent. But the unfinished Eleanor still sat at the table, now smiling. Chapter 9. The Letter Under the Floorboards. There are certain moments in life when time appears to pause, not in the poetic sense, nor as a romantic flourish to mark love or longing, but in the true, visceral way a heartbeat waits between its own echoes, where the very air stills as if reluctant to carry sound forward, as if uncertain of what it might deliver. Miss Marple stood in one of those moments now, alone in Eleanor Weatherby's bedroom, the sun hanging low in the sky behind a curtain no one had drawn, and the wind outside catching on the roof slates as though hesitating before knocking. The room had not changed. Not in any way that would make itself known to a passer-by. The quilt on the bed was still folded with precision, its stitching threadbare in corners where it had been thumbed unconsciously for years. The vanity mirror still bore the faint trace of powder at its base, and a perfume bottle, long emptied, sat as it always had, centred, upright, important. But there was something different in the stillness of the space, not what was visible, but what was underneath. And Miss Marple, in her precise, unassuming manner, knew that what lay beneath had always spoken louder than what lay before the eye. She moved across the room, not with caution, but with the care one gives a place that once held meaning, where each footfall seemed to land not just on floorboards, but on memory. She knelt by the far corner of the room, the one beside the dresser where a single hairpin had been found the week before, old and rust-flecked, buried beneath a crease in the carpet. That hairpin had told her more than anything Eleanor had ever written. She reached now for the brass-handled tool in her bag, nothing more than a gentle pry-bar dulled by time and use. She slipped it beneath the edge of the second board from the wall and leaned gently. There was resistance, then a low creak, not loud, not new, the sound of something sighing open for the first time in years, and as she lifted the plank, the scent of dust and age rose up, as if the past itself had been sealed into the wood. There, folded once and tied with a length of blue ribbon so faded it might once have been any colour, was a letter. Not a document. A letter. Postmarked. Stamped 1954. The envelope had yellowed at the edges. There was no address printed, only a handwritten scrawl across the front. To my future self. Miss Marple sat back slightly, eyes on the writing. The handwriting was unmistakably Eleanor's, and yet the loops were wider, the lines less precise, the E more pronounced, almost childlike in its dramatic curl. She opened it slowly, preserving the ribbon, and unfolded the pages inside. There were 3. The first was brief. If you have found this, then either I have failed or I have succeeded. In either case, you are me, or what's left of me. The second page was longer. It read like a journal entry, but with more urgency, less crafted, more feverish, a ramble written in tidy lines. I've learned that time is not linear, not truly. It bends, it remembers, it plays favourites. The child I once was saw her shadow move ahead of her, and the woman I became chased that shadow without knowing what she was chasing. I have found a way to escape the ache of time, to step sideways instead of forward. I've studied the old ways, the rituals passed through whispers, tucked into margins of books, spoken by women who were buried nameless but not forgotten. They say that memory is the true anchor of identity, that to forget is to fade. But to be remembered is to persist, even beyond the skin. So I've made a choice. A test. I will move between. I will become her, not just in name but in being. There is a girl. She is like me, too like me. The mirror shows us both. The shadow repeats. I will become her before she becomes me. One of us must. The other will forget. Miss Marple read slowly. She paused between each paragraph, not from confusion, but from the eerie familiarity in the tone. This was not madness, not precisely. This was something else. Determination, a cold sort of logic that bordered on obsession, the kind that follows grief too far or memory too deep. The third page was the shortest. If you are reading this, I succeeded. There was nothing more. No signature, no explanation, no mention of Cecily, no mention of a twin. Only a girl, a mirror, a choice, and a ritual. Miss Marple folded the pages once more, returned them to the envelope and rose. The room around her had changed again, not in form but in weight. The air pressed in slightly, as though the act of uncovering had awakened something not dead but dormant. She crossed to the window and peered into the glass, not to see out, but to see what the mirror might reflect. The bedroom behind her remained still, untouched. But there, in the reflection, across the room where no furniture stood, was a chair, and on it the impression of someone seated. But when she turned, nothing. The chair was not there. The air had not stirred, but the reflection had not lied, not this time. She left the room then, moving down the narrow staircase, each creaking step a familiar protest of old timber and older secrets. In the sitting room, the clock had stopped. Not just paused, but reversed. It now read 10 minutes to midnight, and the mantel candle, which she had not lit in days, was newly melted. But no one had entered the room. The tape was playing again, on its own. You were always her. You just forgot. The voice was not Eleanor's. Not quite. It was younger, harsher, like a child trying to sound older than she was. Miss Marple pressed stop, and yet the voice continued, faintly, from beneath the floorboards. She turned. The rug had shifted. Only slightly. She knelt, lifted it. There, beneath a loose plank, was something else. Not paper, fabric. She pulled it free. A dress, small, blue velvet, stitched initials inside, C.W. But not Cecily. This dress was too old. The label inside dated 1931. Miss Marple sat back. There had never been a Cecily. Not exactly. There had been a child, one who had been copied, or one who had done the copying. And the village, perhaps unknowingly, had remembered the wrong one. She stood and crossed the room, placing the letter beside the other findings. Photographs, drawings, tapes, fabric, the hymn book. Together they formed a picture. Incomplete, contradictory, but loud. And all pointed to the same question. Which Eleanor Weatherby had they known, and more importantly, which one still remained? The window pane rattled. Outside, the wind had picked up again, this time from the east, and the sound of a rocking chair, unmanned, began from upstairs. Back and forth. Back and forth. Miss Marple did not flinch. She reached for her notebook and wrote a single line. The ritual was not to forget. It was to replace. Chapter 10. The Imposter Theory. There is a moment in every village when rumour ceases to be entertainment and becomes something else. Less social, more infectious. It is not marked by a scream, nor a sudden crime, nor even a broken window. It begins in whispers, quiet, hesitant, nearly loving in their curiosity, until the whisper becomes worry, the worry becomes recollection, and recollection curdles into fear. That moment arrived in Darnley Green on the 4th Tuesday after Eleanor Weatherby was reported missing. It began, appropriately enough, with the postman. Harold Mentz had carried letters along the same gravel paths for 21 years. Never early, never late, always nodding once to each door as he passed it, as though greeting not the people inside, but the memory of them. He was a man of habit, and habit, as Miss Marple often said, is the most fragile disguise for doubt. He knocked on the vicar's door that morning with a look on his face no one could quite name. The Reverend Crispin, who had seen grief, faith and madness in equal measure over 50 years of parish life, was caught off guard. "She's already gone," Harold said without preamble. "Who?" the Reverend asked, though the answer had already found a place in his chest. "Eleanor," Harold whispered, almost ashamed. "She's been gone. Months, maybe longer." "She was seen last week," the Reverend replied. Harold shook his head once, slowly. "I've been bringing her post for 21 years, and lately I've been leaving it on the step, not because she wasn't home, but because when I saw her through the lace, just for a second, I didn't recognise her." That same day, a woman named Bernice Reed, who claimed to be Eleanor's great-niece by marriage, though no one could ever quite recall which branch of the family she hailed from, appeared on Miss Marple's doorstep without a hat, without gloves, and without the good sense to mask her urgency. She wasn't Eleanor, Bernice said, trembling, her fingernails digging into the hem of her own coat, as if pulling at the truth might unearth something more certain. Not the last time I visited. She opened the door and smiled, but it was the wrong smile, too straight, too slow. Like she had to remember how. And what did you do? Miss Marple asked gently. I left, she said, and I haven't come back until now. Why now? Bernice hesitated, glancing at her own reflection in the hall mirror. Because I saw her, she whispered, 2 nights ago, in the organ loft, wearing Mother's brooch. But she never knew Mother. And she wasn't older, she was younger. Miss Marple did not blink. She made tea. That evening, the final veil of calm unravelled. It came from across the green, where Edith Sims, retired nurse, formerly head matron at East Wexford Infirmary and a woman of unimpeachable rationality, arrived at the Weatherby house uninvited, her eyes wide with a truth she had not yet named. I helped her, she said, standing stiffly in the threshold of Eleanor's cottage. Helped her bury it. The box. Miss Marple asked. Edith shook her head. I don't know. She said it was old and that it needed to be buried before the equinox. She was very clear on the timing. It was wrapped in cloth. I never saw what was inside. When was this? Last year, autumn. There were yellow leaves and she said the moon was full. Miss Marple waited. Edith's voice dropped. But the thing is, Jane, I don't remember where we buried it or why I agreed. Only that when she asked, I did. And now I'm not sure I was with Eleanor at all. Behind the scenes, something darker was lurking, not in the form of a threat, nor a danger one could name aloud, but in the unravelling of certainty, the way a village that had always trusted its memories suddenly could not recall the colour of Eleanor's door before the spring, or whether she had ever actually taught at the school, or if she had lived alone all those years. More troubling still was what occurred at the museum archives the following morning. Miss Marple had returned to confirm a detail in the 1964 class photograph. The one that had, weeks ago, displayed 2 versions of Eleanor, one as teacher, one as child. But now, there was only one Eleanor. Only the teacher. The girl beside her, once so familiar, now bore a different face, softer, rounder, someone else entirely. She requested access to the negatives. The curator refused. He was shaking slightly. We don't have them anymore, he stammered. They were moved. To where? He blinked. I don't know. Miss Marple returned to the cottage, her notebook now filled with contradictions. Names circled, then crossed out. Dates corrected, then uncrossed. Arrows leading nowhere. She sat in Eleanor's study, beneath the ticking of a clock that did not match the time on any other in the house. And she began to review the letters again. Particularly the final one, the one signed only, if you are reading this, I succeeded. She retrieved a fingerprinting kit from her bag, an old habit, never much discussed, acquired from an inspector friend who once remarked that even ghosts leave fingerprints, if one knows where to look. She dusted the corner of the envelope, lightly, gently, one print, smudged. She moved to the seal, another, partial, elongated. Then the bottom edge, clear, crisp, too small. She scanned them all. Catalogued and compared. The print from the wax seal did not match the others. It did not even match Eleanor's known samples. She checked again. Confirmed. There were 2 fingerprints on the same letter, neither matching. Not Eleanor. Not Cecily. Someone else. Someone forgotten. Or erased. And that's when she saw it. Across the room, in the full-length mirror beside the bookshelf, placed there by Eleanor not for vanity but for alignment, Miss Marple saw her own reflection, seated in the armchair, notebook in hand, expression as steady as ever. But beside her, where no one sat, a shadow moved. Not in the room, only in the glass. It leaned forward slightly, then back, mimicking a breath, but no breath stirred in the room. Miss Marple rose, crossed to the mirror, stared directly into it. She saw herself, alone. She turned, nothing. But the armchair pillow was indented. There was one truth left unspoken. and it was waiting for her. Still, Chapter 11, The Girl in the Cellar. The house no longer felt like it had a floor plan. It had become something else. Less a structure, more a memory retracing itself in timber and plaster, with walls that no longer obeyed the logic of architecture, but instead arranged themselves by chronology, trauma, and repetition. The doors still opened where they always had, but behind them, time no longer flowed forward. It circled, it hesitated, it returned, and now Miss Marple had begun to suspect it descended. She had searched the house thoroughly in the early days, as any detective would, with her particular brand of quiet scrutiny. She'd inspected every wardrobe, behind each bookcase, beneath the carpets, through the attic and into the garden shed that now hummed faintly when the wind touched it wrong. But today she returned to the hallway, to the baseboard panel that ran along the wall beneath Eleanor's stairs. The kind of panel one might glance at for decades without seeing. And yet, when the light shifted through the lace curtain that morning, just for a moment, it had glinted. Not from dust, from metal. She knelt with the same care she always applied to the uncertain, neither fearful nor rushed, only deliberate. Her fingers traced the seam until they met resistance, a latch, small, painted over, invisible unless one knew where to press. She pressed. The panel clicked, softly, and then the wall moved, just slightly, just enough. The false wall, long sealed, groaned as it gave way, revealing a narrow, blackened cavity behind it. More crawl space than hallway at first glance. But the air it exhaled did not smell of insulation or disuse. It smelled of time, compressed, preserved, trapped beneath years of forgetting. And at its far end, a staircase, stone, carved unevenly, older than the floor above it, older than Eleanor's family records. Miss Marple lit the lantern she had kept ready since the third night, the one she hadn't dared use until now, and descended. Each step thudded into her bones, not for its noise, but for its weight. The stairs descended farther than they should have, beneath the house, beyond the foundation, until the stone began to glisten slightly, not with water, but with condensation that clung like sweat to the walls. The cellar was not wide. It opened into a narrow room barely 10 feet across, with walls made of hand-laid stone, not brick. There was no electricity. But the air was dry, recently disturbed, as if it had been opened and then closed again, not years ago, days. The first thing she noticed was the cot, wooden, narrow, with a thin mattress too short for an adult. A child's cot. It sat against the far wall, beneath a wooden beam that had warped slightly with time. At its head, a small shelf built into the stone, held a hairbrush, 2 folded ribbons, and a book with no title. A diary, perhaps. She did not touch it. Beside the cot, a dress hung from a single nail. Blue, velvet, familiar. Too familiar. Miss Marple moved slowly toward it, every step now accompanied by the sound of her own heartbeat, which had risen, not from exertion, but from proximity. Something was here, not watching, not hiding, not even waiting. Something remembered. The dress was still warm, as if someone had removed it only moments before. Her hand hovered near the fabric, but did not touch. Instead, she turned her attention to the final object in the room. The mirror. It stood upright against the far wall, too large for the space, ornate, the frame carved in a style that did not match any other furniture in the house. It was not decorative, it was ceremonial, the kind of object that held meaning before it held reflection. The surface was dark, not from dirt, from depth. Miss Marple stepped closer. The mirror began to hum, not with sound, not truly, but she could feel it, in her teeth, in the soles of her feet, a vibration without vibration. She peered in. Her reflection greeted her. Older, as expected, but then, behind her, in the reflection only, the cot. Occupied. A girl, hair curled, eyes closed, hands folded gently across her stomach. She turned. The cot was empty. She looked back. The girl was still there, now sitting, eyes open, not afraid, not smiling, simply watching. The heartbeat in her ears quickened. The mirror's humming rose, and then, without a single sound in the air around her, a handprint appeared. On the inside of the glass, small, delicate, pressed slowly, with intention. Still warm. Miss Marple did not move. She only whispered, "There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting." And now it had found its voice. Chapter 12. She was never alone. There are kinds of loneliness that do not come from absence. Some dwell in the presence of another, especially when that presence was never truly invited. The kind of loneliness one feels when shadowed not by emptiness, but by a duplicate too perfect to be ignored. Miss Marple had long understood the ways people learn to live alone. What she had not seen, until now, was what it meant to live beside a version of yourself that was never supposed to exist. The handprint was still there. Pressed faintly against the inside of the mirror's cold surface, 5 small fingers fanned in perfect measure. Their shape too precise to be accident, too fresh to be memory. The warmth had not faded, not fully, and Miss Marple, standing alone in the stone cellar beneath Eleanor's house, stared at it with the calm of someone who had already accepted what others would call impossible. She did not blink. She did not move. Instead, she reached for her notebook and, without looking away, wrote, "There are 2 of her. There always were." The mirror, humming softly now, no longer reflected the room in its entirety. Its edges shimmered. Not brightly, but just enough to suggest misalignment, like glass caught in the heat before it shatters. And where the cot had once appeared, now only darkness remained, not shadow, but absence. Miss Marple returned upstairs, slow step by slow step, each footfall seeming to echo with more than just her own weight. The house greeted her not with creaks or chills, but with silence, expectant, watching. She moved to Eleanor's study. Not the sitting room, not the kitchen, but the narrow room at the end of the hall where Eleanor had once kept a desk and nothing else. There, on the shelves above that desk, sat a row of journals, identical, numbered not by volume but by colour. There were 13 in total. Miss Marple had read 6. She reached now for the 7th. It was thinner than the others. Its binding cracked when she opened it, but the ink inside was clear. She has always been there, in the mirrors, in the corners of photos, in my voice when I speak too fast. I used to think she was imagination. Then I realised she was memory. She doesn't live where I live. She lives where I used to be. The entries became erratic. The penmanship changed, not in style but in pressure. The lines deeper, as if the hand behind them pressed harder to make the words stay. She speaks like me, laughs like me, but it's not mine, it's stolen. She tells me I gave it to her, that I was tired, that I wanted to rest. But I never agreed. I never said yes. Then, she calls herself Eleanor too. Miss Marple turned the page. The next entry was not in Eleanor's hand. The lines curved upward at odd angles, the spacing inconsistent, the strokes lighter, as if written by someone mimicking rather than remembering how to write. "I'm the real one. I'm the one who stayed. She left. She looked away. I was in the mirror and she turned her back. Now she wants to come back, but there's no room." Then a drawing. 2 figures, identical, standing side by side, but only one with eyes, the other blank. Miss Marple closed the journal and retrieved the 10th volume. She had skipped it before. It had felt too new, too raw, but now she understood. Now she needed to see it. Inside, the writing returned to Eleanor's proper hand, neater, more resolved. I tried to contain her. I tried to name her, but names do nothing if they are remembered wrong. She lives in the memory of others now. She walks through the village as me. She wears my coat, my smile. They see her, and they believe. But she is not me. She is only what they think I am. And I can't make them forget. There were no more words on the final page. only ink scratches. A dozen small circles, one in red, the rest black, all smudged, as if the pen had trembled, or the hand had. Miss Marple set the journal down. She looked toward the mirror in the hallway. Not large, but clean. She walked to it slowly, the light above flickering slightly as she passed beneath it. She stood in front of the glass and watched. Her reflection stared back, unmoving. But behind her, just for an instant, a girl, hair curled, hands folded, eyes open. She turned. No one. She looked back, and her reflection blinked. Once, then again. But she had not blinked at all. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for the frame. Not the mirror, the wood. It was warm, still, as if recently held. There was one truth left unspoken, and it was waiting, in her own face, in her own name, and soon it would speak. Chapter 13, The Second Self. There are truths that arrive quietly, not with the thunder of revelation, but with the soft weight of inevitability, as if they had been standing beside us all along, waiting patiently for us to stop pretending we didn't see them. In the case of Eleanor Weatherby, truth had no need for drama. It simply stepped out from behind the mirror, brushed dust from its lapels, and took its seat at the table where it had always belonged. Miss Marple stood in the study, the last journal still open, the handwriting flickering between styles, between selves. The candle beside her burned lower, yet the shadows had lengthened, not from flame, but from something else. Time, perhaps, leaning in. She now understood. Eleanor had not vanished. She had not been taken or replaced or hidden. She had multiplied, once, and then again, until the line between the version she performed for the world and the one she buried inside had frayed so finely they no longer knew which of them held the name. It had not begun with madness. It had begun with memory, with grief. The journals, when read in sequence, when truly read, not skimmed or catalogued, told the story not of a woman lost, but of a woman choosing to survive in the only way she believed she could, by sharing the burden of self. Not metaphorically, literally, Miss Marple traced her gloved fingers across the last journal's final line, which had been scratched so deeply into the paper that the words had nearly torn through. She was born the day I could no longer remember what I had done. There had been a choice, long ago, and that choice had splintered something. It had left Eleanor with two names, one to wear in public, the other to whisper when alone. But behind the scenes, something darker was lurking. Not a threat, not a monster, just the part of herself Eleanor had asked to stay quiet, the part that obeyed, for a while. Miss Marple rose, collected the journals one by one and carried them to the sitting room. She placed them on the rug in a circle. 12 volumes arranged in a clock face, the 13th resting in the centre. The pages of each were worn, touched, used. All except the 13th. That one had a page that had not been turned in years, or minutes, it was hard to say anymore. Outside, the air shifted. No wind, just pressure, as if something had moved in the village without leaving its home. Miss Marple turned toward the display cabinet, the one filled with Eleanor's porcelain dolls. 12 of them, each labelled with the name of a month. January, February, March, all the way round the shelf. The 13th space had always been empty, but now, without sound, without warning, a figure sat there, small, wooden, familiar. The unfinished doll from the toy maker's house, but now completed. Clothed in blue velvet, its eyes closed. For now, Miss Marple stepped closer and noticed a slip of paper tucked into the hem of the doll's dress, folded tightly. Small, she pulled it free. She remembers what I want to forget. And now she wants to be remembered too. Because if no one forgets her, I cannot be forgiven. Miss Marple turned to the mirror above the mantel. It no longer reflected her face. Instead, it showed the sitting room as it had once been, years earlier. The wallpaper unchanged, the fire newly lit, and on the rug, 2 girls. Identical, one sitting, the other standing behind her, braiding her hair, both smiling, but only one set of lips moved. Miss Marple stepped toward the glass, her reflection returning gradually with each pace. And just as she stood before it, fully centered, her reflection blinked. Once, then again. But she had not blinked at all. The truth was no longer hidden. Eleanor had become 2. One had lived, the other had watched. One had taught, had walked the garden, had smiled at the postman, had folded the shawl. The other had whispered behind mirrors, blinked in photographs, hummed lullabies beneath floorboards, and slept beneath the house. The real Eleanor? Both. Neither. It didn't matter anymore. The house had known the difference. The mirrors had remembered. And now so did Miss Marple. She turned toward the dolls once more. The 13th figure sat still, until it wasn't. Its eyes, long sealed shut, fluttered, opened, and with a breathless hum of the air around it, a voice emerged, soft, like silk torn in the middle. "Now you'll remember me." And Miss Marple, who had never forgotten anything, nodded once, because there was one truth left unspoken, and it had just spoken. Chapter 14. A Village That Forgets. There are funerals that feel like endings, and there are funerals that feel like pauses. Like something unfinished has been covered over with dirt and hymnals, wrapped in black coats and polite nods, buried more to forget than to mourn. Eleanor Weatherby's was neither. It was an absence, a suggestion, a formality disguised as a ritual. No family arrived, no records confirmed, no mourners wept openly. The casket was closed, lowered not into earth, but into conversation, quickly, briefly, and without lingering. The headstone bore only her initials, not her name, not her birth date, just E.M.W. Miss Marple stood slightly apart from the gathered crowd of 13-12 villagers and the vicar, her hands clasped, her expression unreadable, her thoughts not in the churchyard but in the study, in the cellar, in the mirror that still refused to speak plainly. The sky above held neither sunlight nor storm, only a grey that pressed lightly against the world without announcing itself. There had been no cause of passing recorded, no coroner's summary. The officials arrived, noted the house's structural instability, and left with more silence than they had entered with. The house, they said, was likely to collapse soon. No one had thought to ask why. Miss Marple knew why. It was not the house's fault, it was the memory inside. Memory, she had learned, has weight. Too much of it in one place and the structure begins to crack, to resist, to pull inward as if trying to bury what it can no longer contain. By the time she returned to the cottage that afternoon, alone for the last time, there were already signs. The wallpaper had begun to peel in the hallway. The air felt damp in the attic, despite the lack of rain. The floorboards beneath the bedroom let out a long, uneven groan, as if reluctant to hold her any longer. She did not stay long. She collected the final journals, all 13, placed them in her satchel. She stood one last time before the mirror above the mantel, and this time it did not reflect her. It reflected the empty chair behind her, the shawl, the teacup, but not her. She did not flinch. Instead, she walked to the garden. The rosebush where the box had once been buried was gone now, roots upturned. Earth settled oddly. The soil did not remember its shape. It had begun to fill itself, as though correcting an old wound. Miss Marple reached into her coat to retrieve a handkerchief, and paused. In the pocket, something else. Paper, folded twice. She did not remember placing anything there. She unfolded it. A child's drawing, done in thick strokes of blue and green and brown. A cottage, 2 stick figures, one taller, one smaller, holding hands. In the upper left corner, a sun with 12 lines. And in the bottom right corner, a name. Eleanor, age 7. Miss Marple stood very still. The drawing fluttered in the breeze, just slightly. She turned it over. On the back, 5 words. Don't forget which one I am. She looked up. The cottage groaned. Not from wind, not from age, from within. The roofline tilted, just enough to notice. The front step cracked. The windows darkened. The air exhaled. And then, slowly, gently, the house began to collapse inward. Not explosively, but almost with relief. The front room caved, followed by the sitting room, then the stairs. The attic folded like parchment, and the chimney sank, leaning as though bowing to a story well told. Miss Marple did not move. She only watched, until it was done, until only the foundation remained. A perfect, empty square of stone. By evening, the villagers had already begun to forget. The vicar referred to the overgrown lot near the edge of town as the old allotment. The postman said he hadn't delivered there in years. Mrs. Dunridge, who had once claimed Eleanor had the best roses in Darnley Green, now insisted no one had lived there in her lifetime. Miss Claremont couldn't find the 1964 photograph anymore. It had vanished. The frame now held a picture of tulips. No one noticed, but Miss Marple remembered. Because she had seen the reflection blink. Because she had heard the cellar breathe. Because in her pocket now, the child's drawing had begun to fade. Not with age, but with erasure. She returned home that night, quieter than usual, her notebook unopened on her desk. She made tea. She sat in her parlour, light low, curtain half drawn. And she looked across the room, to the mirror. There she was, as always, grey hair, shawl around her shoulders, cup in hand, still. Until she smiled. Miss Marple did not, but the reflection did. And then the reflection lifted its teacup, before she did. Chapter 15. Now it's your turn. There are endings that resolve, others unravel. But the rarest kind of ending, one scarcely recognised, seldom spoken of aloud, is the kind that loops silently behind your eyes, hours after the story has ended, making you question what you saw, what you knew, what you remembered, and what you didn't. Eleanor Weatherby was buried on a Tuesday, or perhaps she wasn't. The house where she lived is gone. The foundation buckled inward, the walls caved, the memory scrubbed clean by time and silence. You could visit the plot now and it would tell you nothing. No whispers in the grass, no rosebush at the gate, no echo behind the chimney where her shadow used to sit. You could ask the postman, the vicar, even the child who used to deliver wildflowers to her porch, and they would all give the same soft blink of confusion. There was never a woman by that name. And yet Miss Marple knew otherwise. She knew because her mirror still hadn't corrected itself. She knew because the teacup on her own sitting room table had moved, twice, without her. And she knew because, late last night, long after the last of Darnley Green had fallen still, she heard a knock on her door. It wasn't loud, it didn't repeat, but she had opened it slowly, and there had been no one there. Only a slip of paper, folded like a child would fold a note passed across a classroom. Miss Marple opened it at her writing desk by candlelight. Inside, in a hand she both knew and did not, "I didn't forget you." Beneath that, in different ink, "Now you won't forget me." She sat with it for some time, not studying it, not analysing it, just remembering. And in the morning, when she passed by her mirror once more, something had changed, not in her face, in the reflection behind her. The photograph on the wall, one she hadn't placed, now showed Eleanor. Not as an old woman, as a child, standing in a schoolyard, alone. But if you looked closely, just over her shoulder, another face, blurred, almost identical, both smiling, but only one had eyes that followed you. So now, dear listener, dear viewer, dear detective, now it's your turn. You've heard every clue, you've seen the journals, you've listened to the whispers, you've followed Miss Marple down staircases no one knew existed. You've felt the weight of a name passed between mirrors, between dolls, between decades. And still, the question remains, was Eleanor ever real? Or was she always two, split not by madness, but by memory? Not haunted, but echoing. What would you have done? Would you have opened the mirror? Would you have burned the journals? Would you have remembered her? or would you have let her be forgotten? And if you looked now, if you turned your head gently toward the dark corner of your room, the part just beside your own reflection, would you see her? Would she still be watching? Would she be smiling? Or would she be waiting? Because there was one truth left unspoken, and now it has been whispered. But you missed something. Yes, you. Not her, not Miss Marple, you. A word, a detail, a face in a photo, a second teacup. A curtain that moved just before the scene cut away. A child's drawing, a journal entry dated before it could have been written. Go back, look again. But do it soon, because memories fade, and names disappear, and sometimes so do stories. But if you remember, she remembers. Comment below, who or what was the real Eleanor? Subscribe for more tales that vanish unless you remember them. And one final note, if, just before you sleep tonight, you glance at your reflection and see it smile before you do, run.